Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lauren, I'm a food photographer and I love sharing all my best tips on food photography tutorials. So if you're into that, hit that subscribe button, don't forget to hit the little notification bell, and let's get into today's video. So one of the questions that you guys ask me the most is, which lens shall I use for food photography? I have this camera, tell me which lens is the best one. Well, today we're going to be talking all about camera lenses because it's just not quite that simple, and I want to give you a bit of background about how to choose the right lens for you. Which lens you use for your food photography will change the look of your photo more than any kind of camera. Now, we are going to briefly touch on the difference between crop frame and full frame cameras because when it comes to choosing lenses, this is a really key difference to understand. So the trick to choosing the perfect lens is really understanding what kind of photos you want to take and then which kind of lens is going to help you achieve that. So there is no one size fits all for lenses. So what I'm going to take you through today is the key differences between lenses, how they behave, what kind of photos you can take with each different kind of lens, and then you can figure out which lens is going to suit you best for your style and your work. So let's jump in to point number one. So let's kick off with a little bit of geeky stuff. So the focal length of your lens is a distance in millimeters from your camera sensor to the point of convergence where the rays of light will cross to create a tack sharp image on your camera sensor. And when it comes to focal length, the higher the number, the more zoomed in your image is going to look. So a 100mm lens is going to create a more zoomed in look than a 50mm lens. So before we start going too much down the route of what focal length means, this is where it's really key to understand what the difference between a crop frame and a full frame camera really is. The sensor in a DSLR or any digital camera is a piece of your camera that's going to capture all the data that's going to make up your photo. It replaces the function of film in analog cameras, so you can kind of think of it as the film in your DSLR. The standard sensor size is equivalent to 35mm film, and this is what we call a full frame camera. Any smaller sensor sizes are referred to as crop frame, and any larger sizes are referred to as either medium format or large format sensors. So what you can see now is a picture on the screen taken on a full frame camera. Now, if I was to stand in exactly the same position, use exactly the same lens, and just swap out the camera for a crop frame camera, then what you would see would be reduced to what is inside the red box. Now, when it comes to what you'll actually see from your camera, this red box is just illustrative because each individual camera has its own crop factor, and you can find out what your camera's crop factor is just by Googling the model. So for my Canon 80D, I know that it has a crop factor of 1.6 times. So what I need to do is, with any lens that I'm using, I have to multiply the focal length by 1.6 to figure out the equivalent focal length and how that lens is actually going to behave on my crop frame camera. So for example, with my 50mm lens, that acts like an 80mm lens on a crop frame camera. So when it comes down to it, does it really matter if you have a crop frame or a full frame? I would say no. I mean, yeah, there are differences between them. I have recently moved to full frame, but I spent the first 3 years of my career on a crop frame, and it's absolutely fine. You just really have to bear the effect that the crop frame has on your lenses when choosing them to make sure that what you're ending up with is lenses that have an equivalent focal length of what you actually want. And just a quick important note that some lenses are specifically built for crop frame cameras, which means if you were to take that lens and put it on a full frame camera, you're not actually going to get a good full frame image because the edges are going to be like weirdly vignetted. It's not really going to capture it. So that is just something to bear in mind if you're trying to buy lenses that you want to take with you as you upgrade your camera to a full frame. Okay. So now let's jump into the effect that focal length has on your actual photos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some example photos of 1, changing the lens on my camera, and then 2, changing the position of the camera to show you how different lenses behave. So for the first example, I'm going to take 3 different photos, one using a 28mm lens, the second one using a 50mm lens, and the last one using a 100mm lens. I'm not going to change anything except for the lens on the camera. So I'm going to leave the tripod in exactly the same place. I'm not going to change anything about the setup. And now on screen, you can see the difference between them. Now the 28mm lens is really zoomed out with a really wide field of view, and the subject looks pretty small in the middle of the frame. Moving on to the 50mm, we're suddenly a lot more zoomed in. So this is what I was referring to earlier as the more zoomed in effect that you get with higher focal lengths. And then on the 100mm, this is a lot more extreme. So what you can see is that the higher the focal length you go, the more zoomed in your picture looks. So based on the first example, you might be thinking, well, why don't you just buy a lower focal length lens, so a wider lens, and then just move yourself closer to the subject when you want that more zoomed in look? It seems logical, but it just doesn't quite work that way because they have some funky things going on with perspective when you just move yourself closer to the food. So in the next example, we're going to use the same 3 lenses, but instead of keeping the camera in the same position, I'm going to move the camera so that the bread stays in the same place in the frame and roughly the same size, so that you can see exactly what would happen if you were to do that. So what you're seeing here is how the perspective changes between the focal lengths. So for the 28mm, the board looks really kind of long and stretched at the front, or like the bread has moved further back, which it hasn't at all. In all 3 of these pictures, everything is exactly the same except for the position of the camera. So when you try and use wide angle lenses for shots like this, it has this kind of weird stretching effect, making things like the lines of perspective look more dramatic than they actually are, and it can result in some really funky looking food photography with fishbowl effect. You can also see how dramatic the change in what you see in the background is, and this is because wider lenses have a wider field of view. So even when the subject is taking up the same amount of space in the frame, what you see around it is a lot more the wider the focal length. Now, it's important to remember that no focal length is better than another. It really depends what it is you're trying to achieve in your photos as to which focal length will suit you best. We're going to come back to that a little bit later when I show you my lens collection. Okay, so let's move on to point number 2. For this point, we are going to be talking about prime lenses versus zoom lenses. Now, a prime lens is a lens with a fixed focal length. So if you have a 50mm lens, it's always 50mm, and a zoom lens has a range of focal lengths. So that could be 18 to 25mm, 24 to 70, 18 to 300. There's like a whole myriad of lenses out there. Typically for food photography, prime lenses are a better choice, and there's a couple of reasons why that is. A prime lens in itself has a simpler internal structure than a zoom lens, which means it can really focus on being a great lens at one focal length rather than a good lens at a lot of focal lengths. And when you start looking into zoom lenses that really are great lenses at every focal length that they have, the price really rockets. So for me, the best way to get the best quality out of my photos and give me the range of focal lengths that I need is to buy several prime lenses rather than one zoom lens. Now, yes, this is more expensive than buying one zoom lens, but I really do believe the payoff in quality is better. That being said, it is not the end of the world to shoot with a zoom lens at all. I think just make sure that you get a lens that encompasses all of the focal lengths you're going to need for the kind of photos you want to take. Okay, let's move on to number 3. So we're going to talk about the maximum aperture of a lens. So when we're talking about how fast a lens is, we are talking about how wide the aperture ring can go. A wide aperture involves using a low f-stop number, which lets in more light and creates a skinnier depth of field, giving you more background blur in your images. You may think that you need a really super wide lens in order to get that creamy background blur, but you really don't. The widest aperture on any of my lenses is f1.4, and honestly, I really rarely find myself shooting at f1.4 because the effect is really dramatic. It does depend on the focal length of your lens as to how the f-stop number performs. On a longer focal length, say like 100mm, the effect of f4 is going to be way more dramatic than it will be in a 35mm lens. So that's something to bear in mind as well. For my food photography, I normally shoot somewhere between f2 and f5.6, depending on if it's a straight on shot or a top down shot where I want more things to be in focus. I will occasionally shoot with a narrower aperture, so a higher f-stop number, if I really have a lot in my frame and I want to make sure that everything is really tack sharp. So when thinking about the maximum aperture that you need to figure out what kind of pictures you want to take, how much background blur you think you want to create, and then pick based on that. And let's move on to number 4. So for number 4, we are going to be talking about macro lenses. So macro lenses have a magnification capability of 1.0 times or a 1:1 ratio. And what this means is that your camera has the ability to take a full life-size picture of what your subject is on the camera sensor. It means you can get really up close to something and it will still be in focus. So you may, when you think of macro photography, think of like really close up insect eyes where it's like all shiny, or like having that one berry in the frame that's like covered in water. But you don't have to go quite that up close to get the effect of macro in your food photography. I really love using this for things like fresh produce, where I really want to highlight the detail by getting just that little bit closer than I can get with my non-macro lenses to the food, really capturing all the detail. So while macro is not necessary for great food photography, I really think it gives you some options to shoot some exciting photos. And for number 5, we are going to be talking about optical quality. The optical quality of your lens is what defines, well, the quality of your lens. So lenses with a better optical quality are going to have less issues like chromatic aberration or distortion or any of those kind of things. So when you're choosing a lens, it really pays off to use a lens comparison tool. One of the ones that I like to use is on the digital picture, so I'll leave that linked below. This is a really cool tool where you can go in and compare lenses in so much detail, in like so many different situations. You can see how they perform at different apertures and on different cameras, and it really pays off to look at several different brands before making a decision. Okay, so now we have covered the 5 things that I think are really important to consider when you're choosing your food photography lenses. I'm going to quickly show you my food photography lenses that I have in my kit right now. So the first lens is a Sigma 35mm f1.4. It's an art series lens. This is the widest lens that I have, and I mostly use it when I'm doing top-down shots where I really have quite a lot to capture. I don't really use this lens for straight-on shots because, like I said earlier, I don't really like the perspective it gives, but it is absolutely perfect for capturing big table scenes. The second lens that I'm currently using is a Sony Zeiss 55mm f1.8 lens. This is a really great all-round lens. It's the lens that I'm filming on right now. It's a really nice focal length. It allows me to do top-down shots that aren't too wide. So if I've got like a smaller table, or I really want to capture the detail of a dish from above, it's a great lens for that. But I can also do those straight-on shots without any of this weird perspective going on as well. With a maximum aperture of f1.8, it really allows me to get a really nice background blur, and I really don't feel like I need it to go wider than that. And the last lens in my kit is also a Sony Zeiss. It's a 90mm f2.8 macro lens. Now, I don't want to choose favorites, but if I had to choose a favorite, I would probably choose this one. This is the lens that is probably on my camera like 80% of the time, because I just love this focal length for the style of photography that I do, which is quite a lot of straight on work. I love the look this gives. It's got a really nice perspective. The bokeh is a really great quality, and yeah, I just love this lens. So if you're really into those kind of straight on shots or like looking at things head on, I really would look into longer focal length lenses. And the macro capabilities on this lens have allowed me to take some really cool produce shots, like the one of these blueberries and beans, which I just kind of quickly snapped after I'd been to the farmer's market. And yeah, I really love being able to capture that sort of rustic detail in the side of food. So I hope you found this video useful. I hope this gave you some insights into how to choose the best lens for you. I'm going to leave a link to the full blog post down below, so do check that out. And don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. I'll be back next week for another food photography video. Hit the thumbs up button if you liked today's video, and I will see you next week. Bye guys.